What's up guys, my name is Robin and I make stuff, and today I'm going to take you back through a recent online workshop that I hosted where we painted a really cool snowy scene. And if you're like, wait a minute, hold up, you do online workshops? Yes I do. If you want to know how to get in on that, you can click the link in my channel description as well as the link that I'm going to put in this video description to get on the list to be the first to know when my next workshop launches. In this workshop we painted a really cool snowy scene just like this. That's the exact scene we painted. We had a blast. Wish you were there. Guess what? You get to go through it right now. I'm going to tell you all the little tips and tricks, especially if you want to know how to get this fog. I have some great tips for that. I also have a whole video all about creating fog. I'm going to put a link to that as well if fog is all that you want to do. As usual, if you enjoy hanging out with me like I enjoy hanging out with you, make sure that you give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. I appreciate you so much. Let's get into painting. I'm going to include a little drawing like this in the description notes. You can download it, print it out, and I'll show you in a second how to do a carbon copy straight onto your watercolor paper. If you're someone who likes a challenge and wants to draw this yourself, here comes a quick little tutorial on how to draw these little shacks. I'm just going to show you the one. So I need to find the front corner, which is this one, of this shack, and then there's going to be two lines that go off towards our horizon line, which is imaginary at this point. So I'm just going to draw that front corner, and then I'm going to have two lines that kind of go at this low sloping angle to the left and to the right, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the top point of that line. They're going to go towards those low sloping angles in the opposite direction, so down towards it just a little bit. And then from there you can determine how long or wide or deep or whatever you want this shack to be. Right there, that's what I'm choosing. Then same for the front. I can pick how big I want this to be, so I'm going to say right there. Then I need to find where the peak of the roof is by finding the center of this front box. So draw an X in it. Boom, you found the center. Come up as far as you think looks good. And then from that point, draw a line to the top 2 points of the front corners of your box. Draw a parallel line on the back to the back corner, and then draw a line along the top of the roof. If you want to know more about perspective, you're not going to find it here. I have a video and I will share the link and you can learn more. In the meantime, we're going to skip ahead to making that carbon copy. So print this little drawing out and size it so that it looks about right. You might have to mess with that just a little bit. I can see my line drawing from the underneath side, so I want to rub my pencil over those lines on the back side of the drawing. This will deposit some lead onto the back of that paper. You can also use charcoal, but I have a pencil, so that's what I'm doing. Most people have a pencil lying around. You can use any pencil that you want. Once you get those lines covered, we're going to flip it over, and I'm going to align it kind of in the middle of my paper with a little bit of space between the right-hand edge and where I put this, because I want to have those trees kind of fill in and define the edge of the roof, which will then tell us that there's snow. So we want to be able to put that dark color around there. Once I find the spot, all I have to do is just start tracing the lines that I see, pushing pretty hard so that I can transfer the lead that's on the back of that paper that I rubbed off onto my watercolor paper. Ta-da! Simple as that. That's all we need. We just want to make sure that we have a guide here so that we can paint around it. So we have a few key pieces in this drawing that we need to make sure that we pay attention to. This horizon line kind of starts in the middle of these cabins, so I'm just lightly going to draw a line across here on the left and then on the right. Please don't draw that super dark. It doesn't need to be. It just needs to be sort of a guide of where we know how far down to paint these trees. Then from there we have a row of trees in the back, and we just need to kind of put in a line. We do not need to draw every single tree or every single tree branch, just kind of the basic idea of where these treetops are going to be, where they're going to end. So we have this row of trees, and we have this row of trees, then we have these lighter trees in the back that are pine trees, and then darker pine trees in front. So several different rows or layers of trees as we go from the foreground to the background of this painting. So for this first row of trees, I'm going to start from the top left and kind of sloping down, just create a line. That's it. Just create a line. Don't think too hard about it. For this next row, I'm going to do another line sloping up to the right. I don't really necessarily care about the other dark trees. I can just kind of fudge those as I'm going. But these two big trees, I'm just going to put a vertical line in for where each of those are going to go. Notice I did not draw any of the branches. Now I have this other row of trees here, so I'm going to draw another sloping line, and then all of these lines are coming down into the center, drawing our eye into the middle of this composition, which is kind of on purpose. Now we also have this path. There's a little bit of perspective involved in that. Let's talk about it for a second. If we have a horizon line, which we kind of do, and from that horizon line we have a path that's kind of winding down, but instead of putting the two sides of the path close together on the horizon line, we leave them separated. Look at the difference of when we have more of a slow winding path where it's really close together in the distance, and as it gets closer to us, that path widens out. The path on the left looks like it's going straight up a hill, whereas the path on the right is more similar to what we have going on here. Kind of goes over gradually to the left and then turns, goes back to the right and then turns again and then gets wider at the bottom. That's really important to make it look like it's going further off into the distance versus up this steep hill. So I'm going to come over sloping to the left and then curve it back towards the right and then curve it back towards the left. And as I get towards the bottom, my path is going to spread out just a little bit more, especially as I keep going. So really close together, then it gets wider and wider and wider and wider. That's what happens in perspective. Now we've got these two big trees in the foreground. These are going to really anchor our composition to having a foreground, middleground background. Now these kind of go up, they kind of split off into two separate trees, and those branches kind of go left to right. We don't need to do the branches so much, but I'm going to center the base of these trees kind of in the middle of this section. Put a little line if you want. That line can go away in a second. And then I just slope these up, one going to the left, one going kind of to the right, almost like a V shape. And then you can put a couple of little branches in here. I'm just going to do a few suggestions. I'm going to end up painting most of the branches that you see, but I can put the start of that in there and then erase that line at the bottom if you put that in there. I don't want that in there. Then with some clean water, I am wetting the sky area, which is defined by those first two lines for the layers of my trees. I can tip my board just a little bit and kind of make sure that everywhere is wet. Don't worry too much about whether or not you paint within those lines or the water goes over them. That's kind of irrelevant. We just want there to be water, and we're going to paint within that area and let the water pull down. We don't want some funky hard line. Now I'm going to mix ultramarine blue with a little bit of burnt sienna, and why I do that is because you can already see that burnt sienna has toned that blue down from being this bright, cheery summer blue to more of that gray, wintry sky that causes so much seasonal depression here in the Pacific Northwest. You know the one. I want it to be translucent, so having enough water in there is going to be really important. Then I load my brush up, and I'm just going to do some brush strokes kind of in this wisping motion from left to right at the top of my paper. And because I painted all that water in there, that water is going to pull that paint, soften it, and expand it. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. I also like having all the white space. So don't go in there and feel like you have to rework it and adjust it. Just let the watercolor do what it's going to do. While we're waiting for the sky to dry, we're going to move to another area that's dry, which is this path. We can do the path while the sky is drying. If we're looking at this path, it's got some suggestion of some shadows, maybe some footprints, or, who knows what. We just need to get some light gray, very similar to what we used in the sky. And I'm going to use my long round brush, which I love because it comes to this point and it also has the thickness of a round brush. So it's pretty versatile. So I'm going to use that same color, maybe add a little bit more water to it. And once we put it on the paper, we can always thin it down just a little bit. But before I do that, I want to erase this line, because remember, once I paint over the pencil line with water or watercolor, it's almost impossible, at least for me, to get it off of the paper. So I don't want that. So I got my paint, and I'm just kind of doing some quick little dabs in here, remembering that as things get closer to us in the foreground, they get more detailed, they get darker. So I'm trying to think about that as I'm putting this in here. Much more brush stroke, dabbing, etc. in the front part of this path. Now, once I put this in here, I can go back, clean my brush out, dry it off on my paper towel just a little bit, and I can go back in and kind of lift up, smooth out some of these brush strokes in the background as well as in the foreground to just kind of soften it up and make it look less like the shape of my brush. I don't want all of them to look like this pointy, round brush stroke blob. While it's still wet, I can go back in now with a little bit darker color. So let me just get a little more blue, a little more brown, and just dab a few areas with that darker color. That says maybe there's some deeper footsteps in here, more shadow, but I do want to soften that up. I don't want all of that to look so hard around the edges. A little smoother, a little more diffused in the shadows. And it's great while it's wet to do that. Now your sky should be dry, so we can come in and do this layer of trees in the very, very far back. I'm going to use my brush for the shape of these trees, and then I'm going to put water underneath it and let the water pull the watercolor down. Here we go. Mixing my blue and my burnt sienna. Are you seeing a pattern? We're basically using those colors the entire time. If you hate them, well, too bad, so sad. So with the point of my brush, I'm just going to start over here on the left-hand side, and at the top where my mark is, just kind of dab all the way down, making sure that the point of my brush defines the top of the tree and the roundness of my brush touches each tree together. Then I'm going to clean my brush off, dry it off a little bit, and then drag it along the bottom edge of what I just painted while also dragging it along the dry paper. You have to do this while the paint is wet, otherwise it's not going to be cool. It's not going to do what you want it to do. So I'm going to do this over and over again a few times, making sure that I put this water on the paper. That gives the watercolor somewhere to go. It's not going to go anywhere if it's dry paper. Wet your paper just a little bit, dragging along the bottom edge. And if you have an end over here where you don't like how it's finishing up and it's kind of like this hard edge, you can clean your brush off and scoop that up, paint it back into itself. Don't keep painting it outward, paint it back into itself. Okay, let's do the next set of trees on the right-hand side. See these trees in the back that are very, very light, almost the same color as the trees on the left? That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make this suggestion of trees in the background layer behind these darker trees that are in the front. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to show you. So I'm going to switch to using a number 8 brush, and I'll try it out. If I don't like it, then guess what? I can switch. I also have a number 2 brush that I can use. That's even smaller. What I don't want is to get too focused on the details here. We want a little bit of definition to make these trees look closer than the ones that we just painted, but we don't want to go overboard with that. We want it to feel like there's a gradual progression of detail from the furthest set of trees to the trees that are in the front, these darker trees. So we're going to paint the ones behind, and then we'll come back later and focus on those darker ones. So for now, we're going light again, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, kind of that translucent tea quality in terms of consistency. So back to that gray. This is looking pretty good. All right, we're going to start kind of on the left-hand side, and these pine trees are pretty recognizable by the pointy tip that they come to. So start with a little tiny line or a dot, and then kind of go quickly left to right, left to right. We're not going for a lot of detail here. Just the suggestion of these evergreen style of trees. And I want to put several of them together in sort of a grouping. And then while they're still wet, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the trees on the left and getting my brush clean and then dragging it along the bottom. Okay, so now that I have a bunch of trees right here, I'm going to clean my brush off, dry it off, drag it along the bottom of the trees while also dragging it along the dry paper. As soon as I do that, you can see that watercolor start to soften up into the water that I put on the paper. A lot of people get really worried about blooms, but we're going to do a lot of blooms on purpose. That's a new thing, blooms on purpose. So I'm going to get some clean water on my brush and dab it into those trees, and you can see it kind of bloom out. I think that's really cool. All right, let's keep going. We're going to do another tree right here, bringing it down into the water that we painted, and then let's skip a spot and we'll do another grouping of trees over here on the right-hand side. Notice that I'm bringing them down lower than that reference line that I drew. That's important. I don't want there to be a very noticeable line. I want it to feel sort of organic, a little irregular. And my color's getting a little bit lighter as I progress through this, and that's okay. Now, if you have a weird edge that's starting to develop because that's as far as the water went and that paint's going all the way down to that water, you can clean your brush off, dry it off, and drag it along the bottom. While these trees are wet, I can tap a damp brush into them and lift out some of that color. Then I have that color on my brush, so I have a lighter version now that I can create some lighter trees. And that's a great way of varying the value, which is the dark and the light of what you're painting, especially when it comes to something like this, where you want some things to be dark and some things to be light. Some are disappearing. Is there a tree there? I don't know. Maybe. Yep, there it is. Okay, next we have this row of trees that's a little closer to us, but it's really soft. They're not pine trees. They're like these two big trees that we have in front, and we have all of those branches, so we want it to feel like it's full, but I don't want to put a ton of detail. I'm going to do this a little different by wetting my paper first and then putting the color into the water. Then let's mix up some more ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, kind of in equal parts to make this nice gray color. Imagine that the water I put on there is about 1 inch to 2 inches wide. I'm going to tap this gray color in the middle of that section. That gives that watercolor room to move up as well as down. We don't want to create any hard edges. We want it to be nice and soft. Clean your brush off, dry it off a little bit, and again, drag it along the bottom like we have with all the other trees, smoothing out this end over here so that it feels a little more misty. Then I can come back in with some more of that color and just kind of drop it in some of those spots, very irregular. I want it to feel like the mist is organic. And then again, just kind of going along the bottom of what you've painted all the way down to that horizon line. And once you've done that, just let the whole thing dry. While that's drying, we can come over to our cabins. I'm going to switch to a number 4 flat shader, which works really well for doing architecture. Most buildings have straight lines, and I find it's a little more challenging to accomplish those nice clean edges with a round brush, but you can use that if that's what you have. So with this flat brush, I can come in and do those edges really easily. We're gonna do a light brown first, let that dry, then we'll come back and do a darker brown, kind of sketchy, and then we'll do another darker layer after that. So sort of 3 layers for these cabins. All right, back to our burnt sienna. This time we're just going to use the burnt sienna as is, a decent amount of water in there, kind of like skim milk. And then I'm just going to run this brush along these edges, making a nice clean line, and then fill it in along the sides as well, and almost down to what I imagine the bottom would be. And we can do that on both of these cabins here, making sure that we leave the roof unpainted. That is going to be key to making this snow-covered roof believable. Just trust me. Now I'm going to clean my brush off, dry it off just a little, and kind of run it along the bottom edge of this brown that I painted, and that will soften it up. I want there to be this vibe that maybe there's some snow drifts or it just looks cold. Now that the background's had time to dry, we're going to start putting in these darker trees. These really dark ones on the right-hand side are really going to define the top edge of that roof. Any darker color that we put against the top edge of those roof lines communicate to the viewer that these are snow-covered roofs. Now that these trees are getting closer to us, they're going to have some more detail. They got to have that top point to say that they're pine trees or evergreen trees, and then they're going to have a little more detail in the branches themselves. We also want these trees to be the darkest ones that we've painted so far. So what does that mean? We need more paint. Up to this point, we've been using more water than paint, so very translucent, kind of in that tea consistency. Now we're graduating and moving into more of that milk consistency. We still want it to be somewhat translucent because we're not going to go full send on this, but I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt sienna as usual, and mixing that up, making sure there is enough water so it flows on my paper. It does look pretty dark. Once we put this on our paper, we can then add some water underneath and it will start to pull that paint down. As we pull that paint down, we want to use it to help define the top edge of our roof line. Super important. All right, so little point and then back and forth, leaving little white gaps in between. Super great. It's very normal and that looks very convincing. I only go about halfway down for the size of my tree and then start my next one, and those branches should meet together. So I'm going pretty quick. You don't have to overthink your trees. Just plop some paint in there. Then while it's wet, clean your brush out, dry it off just a little. We're going to go along the bottom edge, just like we've been doing, and start to move that paint down very carefully along the top edge of the roof line. That water is going to pull some of that paint down for us. I can even put some more water in these trees, just kind of plopping it in there. Blooms are great for fog. Now, once I have some of this paint on my brush from just the trees themselves, I can kind of move it over and maybe even make some more trees on the side using that paint. And again, they're going to be a little bit lighter, which is great. It's fantastic. Picking up that paint and making another tree. It's not rocket science, right? Just understanding that when you touch your wet brush to wet paint, it's going to pick it up. And it's going to pick up a little bit depending on how much paint you have there. So you can use that to keep painting. All right, let's do a nice big tall one right about here, coming up above that tree line. Again, the little point, that's key. And then just back and forth, skipping some spots in between. Bring it all the way down to where your other trees are. Put some big, thick brush strokes in there at the bottom. And then we're going to add that water. And that water is going to go up into the tree. You can see in the other ones it's kind of bloomed in there. And then we'll grab some of that paint and do a little tree that's a little bit lighter to the right of that tree. Kind of smooth that paint down along the top edge very carefully of our little cabins. All right, skip another spot. We're going to start to put these other bigger, darker trees in here and define this far right corner of these cabins. Now, I have some water on my paper, but that's okay, because we want it to be soft. So as my paint hits that water, look at how it just softens up. Super cool. I can always go in and tap some more dark color in here once I kind of get the shape where I want it, but it's going to create a really nice foggy effect. I interrupt this program to bring you my sermon number 425. If you have paint on your palette that is looking very thin and you're doing everything that you can to just use up what you've already mixed and it's getting lighter and lighter and lighter, for crying out loud, mix some more paint. There's nothing that says you have to use up every drop that you've already mixed on your palette before you can mix more paint. That rule doesn't actually exist. No one's even said that. Get it out of your head right now. I give you permission. Mix more paint if you need more paint. All right, sermon over. I'm going to paint this tree now on the right-hand side a little bit taller and leaving a little bit of a gap in between the tree on the left and the tree on the right. And this is a big tree, so it's going to come all the way down. Now notice, as I was giving you my sermon, I added some more darkness to that tree on the left while it was wet, and it's kind of softened up. And then as I get down to the bottom of this tree, I'm just really plopping some paint in there. I want it to be dark, and then I can define the edge of that cabin roof. Another pro tip, tap your brush in the water. Don't necessarily rinse it out by smooshing it on the bottom of your water bucket. Just get a little bit of water, wring it off on the side, and then come back to your painting. You'll instantly have a lighter color. And so that's what I did there to make those lighter trees in the background. And then I can get some clean water on my brush and just kind of work this paint down, soften it up in there just a little bit like we've been doing before. I want it to feel soft and kind of organic as it reaches to the bottom where the ground is, quote unquote ground. Look at how nice that's turned out. All right, let's do these trees here on the left-hand side. Some of these tree trunks are darker and then some are lighter, indicating that they're further away. So I'm going to use the paint that I was just using for my big dark trees. I'm going to pull some of that to the side, and then I can add a little bit of water. I want it to be light. I also want it to have some movement to it. I'm using a number 2 round brush. You know, a script liner brush would probably be also very appropriate, or a rigger brush. But I just kind of lift up from the base of where the trunk hits the snow, lift up and kind of wiggle towards the top where I have those soft faded colors. Just wiggle in an upward motion. And then I can also just dip my brush in the water like I was talking about, wring it off on the side and pull it up again. And that will put in some very light brush strokes in the back. And we want those to be a little bit higher up in terms of where they land on the ground. When you're wanting to show things progressing further into the background, they don't all start on the same point in the landscape. For example, if we have a tree right here, and we're going to say that it's on this line. If we want to do a tree that looks further away, and we start it on this same line here, and everything's the same height here, and then we make it shorter on the top, now we just have a short tree right next to this tree. If we want that tree to feel like it's further in the background, we have to imagine that there's another line that goes further into the background here. And we got to start that tree trunk at the bottom there. We got to make everything shorter, potentially. So this tree trunk gets a little bit shorter, maybe the tree height gets a little bit shorter. So here's our tree trunk. Here's our tree. Now that tree looks like it's further away in the distance. On top of that, you have these dark trees in the front. So in addition to making things look smaller and more compressed as they get into the distance, we also want them to be lighter and have a little less detail. So we make that tree a little bit lighter. And then if we have another tree, let's say it goes back to here, this one's got even a shorter trunk. It's getting a little bit lighter. And now that tree's way off in the distance. But notice, this tree top came to here. We could make that tree go up to there, but as long as it's moving back on the ground, that's totally fine. So let's do that example. We'll do one here. We'll do this just a little bit shorter. And we'll make that tree a little bit taller than this tree over here. That tree still looks like it's in the distance because of where it starts on the ground. This is going to be a much taller tree. If we were to put these two side by side, it would be a much taller tree than this. But essentially, you can think of everything kind of going into the distance like this. We want all of these trees to kind of start getting smaller and smaller. And this tree gets a little bit shorter. And this tree gets a little bit shorter until eventually you just have little suggestions of trees, but they all kind of follow that angle. That's how perspective works when you're progressing into the distance. So when we have all of those wiggling trees, those tree trunks, these trees are in the foreground because they're all starting on this line here. If we want some to be in the background, we got to start them a little bit higher up than these. Maybe make them a little bit lighter. Okay, so now it looks like we have trees in the background. And if you want more trees, then you just make them a little bit shorter and a little further back. Closer trees, closer trees, closer trees, more detail in these trees in the front, more branches. That looks like a whole bunch of trees kind of going back into the distance. That's how that's done. Everything kind of gets shorter and smaller and tighter and compressed together as it gets further into the distance. We can't start all of the trees at the same point on the ground and expect them to look like they're getting further into the distance. If you're like me and you don't love the way that the tops of these trees come to this like abrupt brush stroke finish, you can just wet your brush, dry it off a little bit like we've been doing the entire time, and just soften up the ends of those brush strokes. I do that a lot when I'm painting, hence the reason why we're doing it so much in this painting. It's a great technique to use and take advantage of. Also, I am making sure that, just like in my little demonstration a second ago, I'm making all of the tops of these trees kind of follow this descending angle that goes towards the center of my paper. That is a leading line that accomplishes two things. It tells the viewer that these trees are getting further away in the distance, and also it will lead the viewer's eyes right into the center of the composition. Another thing we can do to make these trees look like they're not floating is soften up the bottom edge of those brush strokes. Clean my brush off, dry it off a little bit, and kind of rework the bottom of those brush strokes. Now my paint is looking like it's dried a little bit more than I wanted it to. No problem. Since I just put some water there, I can now go back with a little bit of light gray that I just had on my palette and drop it in there. And then I can soften up that color. And that just kind of gives this idea that there's some shadow there and the forest is no longer floating. Nobody wants a floating forest. All right, we'll let that dry and come back over to our cabins. We're gonna go in with our next darkest color. So as I paint this, I want to leave a few little spots unpainted and let that light brown color show through. This is one of those times you can actually get away with being a little sketchy. All right, so I'm just gonna re-wet this burnt sienna that I have on my palette. And then I have this gray, I'm just gonna grab that. I don't necessarily need to get more blue. We've got the gray on the palette, so let's put it to use. See how that changes the tone of that burnt sienna? It kind of turns it from milk chocolate to dark chocolate. All right, go in here very carefully along the edge of that overhang. And then notice that as I come down, I'm kind of leaving those spaces of unpainted area, and that lighter brown color just shows through. I want it to be a little rough along the bottom, and then I might come in and soften that up in just a second as well. I'm gonna do the exact same thing with the next cabin. Now don't worry if those two browns blend together from cabin left to cabin right. We're going to take care of that on our next layer. So just focusing on putting that dark color in here, being a little sketchy about it, and leaving some of that area underneath to then show through. I personally don't want these brush strokes to look so geometric on the bottom, so with my clean brush that's dried off just a little bit, I'm softening up the bottom of those edges. All right, the background's dry. Now I want to paint these trees in the front, so I have to make sure the background's dry. These trees are going to be the darkest, most detailed thing to anchor our composition, and we're going to do it in a couple of different layers, just like we did the cabin. I'm going to mix a little bit more burnt sienna into that brown that I was just using. Don't be afraid to mix up a decent amount of paint here. And like I said, if you're painting this and you run out of paint on your palette where you had mixed it, just mix some more paint. There's nothing that says you have to use every drop that you already mixed. Don't do that. It's a trap. Just mix some more paint. Now at the bottom, I'm going to put a little bit of water into that to soften it up, to suggest that there's snow. I feel like that works really well with snow having some of that color softened up. This is another great opportunity for you to be sketchy and get away with it. Leave some of the area unpainted. Again, we're working with a snowy scene here, and your eye and your brain together will do a lot of the work for you. You just have to let it. I know, that's the hard part. When you have a snowy scene, that snow may have blown and stuck to the tree. So leaving some white spots, totally okay. At the bottom, I just wet my brush and tapped some water in there while that paint was wet, giving it a little bit of room to go in there. As we go into these branches even more, you don't have to be so detailed right off the bat. We'll go in with the script brush or your rigger brush. So I'm going to do this tree on the right-hand side and just putting the basic suggestion of these main big branches. Like I just said, we'll use a smaller brush. And as I get to the end of a branch, I just sort of use the tip of my paintbrush and kind of wiggle it around a little bit. And then once I painted a few branches, I'm going to make sure that I go in with my clean, kind of damp brush and soften up the bottom area of this tree trunk. And can I just remind you, there's no such thing as a perfect tree. They're all unique. So you got to get it out of your head that your tree is not right or it's painted wrong or whatever silly thing that we make up and tell ourselves to help us feel like we suck at painting. Just paint something that looks kind of like a tree. And then don't beat yourself up about however it turns out. To build on our illusion of snow at the bottom of this tree, I'm just going to get a little bit of blue-gray and a little bit. I want it to be very light, add some water to it, very similar to the footprints or the tracks that I already painted in the snow. And I'm just going to kind of plop some of that in here around the bottom of the tree, making sure that I leave some of that white space. Clean my brush off and dry it off just a little bit, and then soften up some of those brush strokes around the edges of the brush stroke. I'm fine if some of the edges stay that clean, defined edge of the brush stroke, but for most of it, I want it to feel soft. And if you love how it looks with just the plain brush stroke, great, go with it. I love that for you. Somebody asked me, what direction is the sun coming from? Well, we can pretend that it's coming from this top left side. Ultimately, when you have an overcast day, winter day, and it's just diffused light everywhere, you're not going to see a lot of really defined shadows. They're going to be very soft and sometimes even hard to see. So for the sake of this composition, we'll say that our shadows are going to fall to the right-hand side. No matter what light source you use, just make sure your shadows are consistent. So with that in mind, our cabins are going to have shadows on the right-hand side. So we're going to put a darker color underneath the roof overhangs, and then we're also going to use a dark color for these doorways. And then we're going to bring that paint down just a little bit on the sides, but making sure we have a nice clean line for that overhang. Now this is our third layer. We want it to be darker than the second layer. I'm going to use burnt sienna, ultramarine blue. I'm using the leftover gray that I have on my palette. If you don't have any more of that, you can just use ultramarine blue and burnt sienna till you get this dark kind of brown gray color. And then we want to go in very carefully. We want there to be a nice clean line. It's going to define the shape of the cabin as well as the snow on the roof. Whatever you do, make sure you leave that white gap, that white edge of snow on the roof. Put your paint right below it. Don't fill it in. We're also going to paint along the left side of that bigger cabin with darker color. That is going to define that cabin and separate it from the cabin on the left. We don't have to outline. All you need to do to make something stand out is put darker color up against something lighter, and that will let the light shape be more defined without having to use an outline. I can't tell you the number of times I walk around my class and see that my students have outlined something, mostly because they skip ahead and they're not following along. So as long as you're following along, you'll be okay. But get out of your head that you have to outline something for it to show up. Just like what we did with the top side of the roofs on these cabins, we put dark color around them. We didn't outline anything. So we're doing that same concept here now with the cabins themselves. I also want to make sure that I'm kind of softening up these edges down below. Remember, snow, soft, etc. So make sure you're doing that. You can also go back in if you feel like it's not dark enough, which I don't, and put a little bit more dark in there. It's wet, so it should sort of soften and blend on its own. And then for these doors, same thing. I'm just going to get some dark paint and do a single brush stroke. Hopefully it works out. If not, I can adjust it a little bit. Just don't overthink it. One over here, and that one kind of got a little goofy. Okay, no big deal. I'm just going to come back in with a little bit of water on my brush, kind of soften that up a little bit and adjust the way that that looks. See? Easy peasy. I'm also going to soften up the bottom of this other door. The roofs are going to have a little bit of shadow. That shadow is going to be on the right-hand side. We want it to be the color of the snow, very light. And we're going to use that color to define the edge of this cabin on the right and its roof line. This part is really magical and you don't need very much color. Just a little bit in here, making sure I leave that white gap of snow. And just like that, it looks like now there are two separate roof lines, two separate cabins, and I just did a little tiny bit of color there. Pretty magical, but you got to make sure that you leave that white gap. There would also probably be some shadow cast to the right-hand side of these little cabins. So using that same really light color that I used on the roof, we can put a few little sketches of that onto the paper on the right-hand side of the cabin. We don't want to go too dark. These are in the background. So take that into consideration. Just the suggestion of some snow and some shadow. Cabins, check. Trees in the foreground, let's do it. We need a darker color. Similar to what we just did on our cabins, we're going to mix up some dark brown paint, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, kind of mixed together. More brown than blue. We want it to look brown, but more like dark chocolate than milk chocolate. And as we paint this, we're going to let some of the lighter color of paint that we already have on the tree show through. This is another opportunity for these to be sketchy. And remember, we have that light coming in from the left, casting shadow on the right. So we're going to focus this dark color mainly on the right-hand side of our trees, leaving a little bit more of that lighter brown showing through on the left. Following the shape of the tree, notice that I'm leaving some space and some of that light brown showing through. The underside of the branches would also have more shadow than the top side of the branch, so keep that in mind as you're painting. And as you're going up to the top of this tree, you can start adding in more branches. And remember, we're just kind of trailing off the tip of that paintbrush, letting it sort of wiggle its way on the paper. And I'm just doing lots of light little dabs in here. Then clean your brush off, dry it off on a paper towel, and then add a little bit of that water, that clean water, to the bottom of where the base of your trunk is, where it meets the snow. Letting that water soften up the paint on its own is a great way to convey that there's snow on the ground, which we've talked about multiple times throughout this painting. I'm starting to remind myself of my dad, who tells me the same story multiple times as if I haven't heard it before. He also watches my videos. Love you, Dad. With my brush sort of damp, I can pull some of those browns that are still wet on my paper up as if they're little dry grasses poking through the snow. They're very, very light, which is exactly what I want. We're going to work our way up this tree with our much darker color. So ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, kind of equal parts now. That'll make a nice gray or almost a black color, which is exactly what I want. I'm just going to dab this in, staying on that right-hand side, painting even less than I did with the dark brown, because I just want this to feel like that dark shadow. As it's hitting some of the wet areas down below, it's automatically softening up, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want to have happen. Now, I'm going to get my rigger brush or my script brush, get a lot of paint on there, and with the tip of it, I'm going to pull my branches up and away. I find it much easier to do that than it is to pull that paintbrush down towards me. Notice that I'm also holding the paintbrush up towards the end of it versus really, really close down by the bristles. I personally think it's easier to control it in terms of making branches than it is if I hold it way down where the bristles are. Try both ways. Find something that works for you. Don't let me boss you around. You can also press all of those bristles down and get a little bit of a wider stroke. So just play around with your paintbrush. Experiment. That's how you learn things. That's how you learn what you like and what you don't like. You can also do some lighter brush strokes in here, getting your brush a little bit wet and leaving some of that paint on there. The lighter brush strokes give the illusion that there are branches around the back side of a tree. If you want to know why trees are the way they are, then go outside and look at them. Okay, but in all seriousness, I have a video all about painting trees. You can check that out, as well as just going outside and looking at trees and see how they grow and the branches that grow all the way around them in a circle. Not just one branch on the left, one branch on the right, one branch on the left, one branch on the right. I always like to joke around with my students and say, well, that's all there is to it. Let's take the tape off. How do you think it turned out? Not too bad. Hey, thanks for hanging out. I'll see you next time that I make stuff.